Hello, class. Welcome back to History 1301. This is Professor Eric. Today, right now, we'll be doing Chapter 3, which is Creating Anglo-America, 1660 to 1750. Basically, that whole century from 17th century into the 18th century, that transition at the turn of the century there. So we'll be going over that. The last lecture, we began talking about the establishment of British colonial America, the one in Virginia, Chesapeake area, and then New England. Today, we'll be talking about that space in between, the middle colonies, which would be like New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, etc. So we'll be talking about that today, as well as events in Europe. Right? Remember that we're still in this imperial framework. We're not alone here. At least on the Atlantic coast, not yet. We're finding our way to get to be there. Whether we have the Spanish down there by St. Augustine, Florida, and then you have the French going all up and down the Mississippi River, and then all up there in the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River Valley area. So there you have all these empires battling for land here and there. And of course, remember the Spanish Empire hit it big with gold and silver, and the French, their main source of revenue here is going to be the fur trading with their Indian native allies. And then we're going to see here how the Atlantic coast is going to take different kind of economic trajectories depending on their, I guess you call it, geopolitical climate. All right, so we go over that as well. Basically, long story short, we'll be going over this transition from the 17th century colonial America to the 18th century colonial America. That's going to leave the foundation for the discontent between England, the metropole, and colonial America colonists. All right. So where should we begin? I guess we will begin. Let's begin abroad. Let's begin in England. So I keep saying that England is mired in these religious wars between empires and within the empires themselves. So the French have their thing going on. You have the rise of the king's son, or the Sun King, King Louis, I think the 14th. He comes in there and he's trying to reestablish Catholicism, right? So we have Lutheranism, right? Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation, sweeping all across Europe, continental Europe, Germany, England, France. So this Reformation movement is sweeping across Europe, and then you have these very bloody wars, basically, of who's going to rule, what's the right way to rule, under what religious authority, the Pope, right, Catholicism, or Protestantism, right? No Pope, right? Just king, right? Whoever is Parliament. In the case of Britain. So that's what's going on. And here we have that same struggle, religious struggle, spilling into the internal affairs of England's politics. And so we have the English Civil War. So this basically the English Civil War is a struggle for political supremacy. Who has the right to make laws? Who has the right to tax? Who has the right? Who has the power? Right, that's what politics means, power. Who has the power between Parliament? And Parliament here is divided. I'm talking about England here. So think about the Congress of England. It's called Parliament. So Parliament is divided in two houses: the House of Commons and the House of Lords. House of Commons is all about, like I said, it's the commoners, common people. House of Lords, it's like the elite, the landed property owners and rich investors and merchants, etc. You have those two setups here: House of Commons and House of Lords. That's Parliament, and that's representative. That's a representative assembly, the body, elected representative. Um, and then you have the king, and they're vying for control here. Parliament is strongly, it's a lot of Protestants, it's controlled by Protestants, and the king at this moment in the mid 1600s, 1640s here, 1650s, you have the so-called Stuart monarchs from like Scotland, actually. So what happens is that Queen Elizabeth dies. Right? So she has no heirs. She's a queen, the Virgin Queen. She has no sons, no daughters. And they gave it to it was a queen, then Queen Mary, and then their son. And they were Catholics, and they were under the Stuart monarchy. So there was a Catholic monarchy, and they were taking over England, which has been since King Henry VIII, Protestant, who has been the Church of England, been away from Catholicism. So basically, what's going on here is the Parliament is afraid, is anxious, it's all this anxiety that because of the Stuart monarchs, which is his name, James I, and then his son Charles the First. The Stuart monarchs are gonna throw England back into Catholicism, back into what they call these Protestants, these elite merchants, or mostly Protestants, will call popery. Right? You're under the spell of the Pope. You're under the authority, and you're a servant to the Pope. And that was seen as, pretty much as vulgar and backwards for these Protestants, and unpatriotic, right? Like a betrayal to England's dominion, and being under the authority of the Pope. So you had these Stuart monarchs, and they were trying to implement Catholicism back into England. um, about that. So what happens is bloody wars for years. So 1642, Charles raises an army, and he moves against Parliament. So he makes the first move, Charles. Uh, and by 1647, this English Civil War ends. Parliament wins. Parliament ends up being victorious. 1649, Charles gets beheaded, King of the Head, and Oliver Cromwell comes into power. So what happens here is that Charles I is beheaded. The monarchy is abolished, and we have a commonwealth of free states. So we have no king for a while, and it's just kind of a mess. Right? So we kind of restore a monarchy, and Charles II becomes the king again. Again, it's just it creates this civil war, and whose son is it? We tried to go in there. So Oliver Cromwell takes over in 1649. He calls himself the Lord Protector. The Lord Protector until his death. So he dies in 1658. So Oliver Cromwell is like pretty extreme on vengeance. Anyways, but he's also very during his time period here. He's very how do I say it? Aggressive and overseas expansion for the British Empire. You know, he's very like brutal. Basically, he's a dictator. He's a dictator. Put it that way, in a modern sense. He's a dictator. Yet, British Empire is centralized. It's pretty powerful here now. It's only one right? It's pretty much under his command. So you have a centralization of power. So you have able to exert power all around. So there's a big expansion overseas under Oliver Cromwell. Like I said, he's like the leader of Parliament. We haven't figured this out yet. Right? So you beheaded the king, and Oliver Cromwell, the leader of Parliament, becomes basically the new king. He calls himself the Lord Protector. So, anyways, for a whole decade, right, he's rules, and he really pushes this idea of mercantilism that I talked about in my last lecture. So, this idea of mercantilism is the chief object of mercantilism, of this political economy theory here, is that all the nation's economic policies and political policies should serve the state somehow. Everything should serve the state. Everything's for the metropole, for the motherland. But everything you do is to somehow or another to benefit the motherland. So we have the reason why you have this is to kind of facilitate the rise of nation states at this moment in Europe. Right? So the unification of the German nation state, right? The French, and Britain becoming centralized and becoming stronger, and you need for this you need military kind of force this nation state into being, and to also kind of fight his imperial wars across the seas. You need vast amounts of money, right? So the best way to do it is to for everything to serve the motherland. How do you do it? So the way you set this up is that there's only a certain amount of money out there, because there's only hard money that counts. We need gold and silver that only matter, and there's only a certain amount of that in the world. It's like a zero-sum game here. So you lose and I gain. Zero-sum here. And that's the reason why we should go out there and explore these new worlds, right? So right now, Spain has it really big with finding silver in Latin America. Britain hasn't had that yet. But under mercantilism, you find things like timber. You find things like you plant things, right? You create these plantations. You plant like sugar or tobacco in Virginia. We talked about that. John Roth introducing that in Virginia. You plant rice, plant wheat and grains. You chop down trees, right? We're talking about timber here. You make, you send it out and make ships or whatever. So all this raw material, these raw resources, you sell them or you ship them out to the motherland. And they're manufacturing, right? And right? So it's an extractive economy. Right? So everything serves the motherland. And that's what they found here in the Atlantic coast of North America. And Oliver Cromwell really pushed forward this mercantilist political economy into practice. Another example of this mercantilism is the so-called Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were a set of laws requiring all goods shipped to England and its colonies to be carried in ships owned and manned by English men, by English people. So all goods, any kind of trade you have, has to be made via English ships. And that was like the first Navigation Act in 1651. And this included right, for the colonists. So this really was an affront for the Dutch. Okay. The Dutch were the main shippers, right? That was their main thing. They would ship whatever you had, right? Grains, rice, whatever I just mentioned right now. And they would ship it for you. Right? Now with this Navigation Act, now it had to be via English ships. Right? And why is this an example of mercantilism? Because now you're able to tax, right, the Parliament, right, or this now we have a constitutional monarchy. Right? We have parliament and this king, right? Both governing together after the English Civil War. Right? That's pretty much what happened after the English Civil War. We had the creation of this constitutional monarchy. The parliament is still kind of in charge, but you still have the king there making laws, but you have parliament to check and balance each other out, basically. So you have they are able to tax all this goods, all this trade now. So all that extra revenue comes to England instead of Dutch, to the Dutch government. So by forcing trade by the colonies, or all goods being traded between the colonies on English ships, right? You pretty much monopolize, right? Trying to monopolize that trade between the colonies and the rest of the world, basically. That's one part of the Navigation Act. The second part was that all foreign goods going to the colonies had to be shipped via Britain first, where they could be taxed, and some colonial products, such as like the so-called enumerated products, the enumerated goods, such as tobacco, sugar, indigo, cotton, they had to be sent to England for being shipped elsewhere. For customs, for taxes. These are the Navigation Acts. This is a perfect example of mercantilism in action. So that's what's going on here, right? So we have this thrust now that after these years of religious wars, right? We have the English Civil War, and then we have Cromwell bringing us a decade of peace, and then shit hits the fan again over there. But nonetheless, the effects of Cromwell, right, in the English Civil War is that it pursues this mercantilist ideals into action. All right. So, like I said, this Navigation Act had an effect not just to showcase, I guess, Cromwell's imperial ambitions, but also was a way to acquire the Dutch outposts in North America of New Netherlands. So this is the beginnings of the Anglo-Dutch Wars in 1664. So in the 1660s, you have the Royal African Company. So Charles II he's still the king here. So you have the Royal African Company, which is given a monopoly on the slave trade. This is England now, the Englanders. Right? So this is the England king giving this one company, the Royal African Company, the charter, the rights to go and pretty much intervene and try to compete with the Portuguese here and some Dutch people that were the main shippers, right, of the slave trade at this moment. Royal African Company. So again, right, mercantilism, right, a zero-sum game. It's only a certain amount of hard money to make, right? And you try to get that, right? So right now you have the Portuguese and the Dutch owning the slave trade, and here comes the British with the Royal African Company. Mercantilism 101. So there we go. So that's that. And then that really sparks that Anglo-Dutch War. And that war was really about getting those outposts in Africa. So what happened here is that African kingdoms would have slaves, and they would send them from the Central Africa, whatever, in Africa to the coast. The Europeans would come and pick them up. Right? These slaves would be these captives, right? They were mostly war captives, right? Would end up being in these forts, in these factories, for like months at a time. Think about this, like these people were from like Central Africa, a whole new language. They would walk all the way over there. That was a grueling passage that way. then they would see for most of them, almost virtually all of them, they would see the sea for the first time, the ocean for the first time. They would see white people for the first time too. These different languages and guns and stuff, right? Must have been a really terrifying sight. And then off you go to the Middle Passage, right into North America, into Brazil, and into the West Indies, into sugar plantation. It gets worse after that, right? That sucks. Slavery fucking sucked. I'm getting ahead of myself here now. Anyways, we have the Royal African Company, right, coming into that slave trade now, right? Sparks this really this Anglo-Dutch war because the British want to get those African posts. They want to get those forts out there, those factories on the African coast to monopolize on the slave trade. And we have that going on. Let me see what will be the best way. So Britain began to challenge Dutch dominance of the slave trade. 1663, King Charles II, right? That's when he charters the Royal African Company, right, to carry slaves out of Africa into the West Indies. West Indies, sugar plantations. Right? Think about that, right? They equate to each other, basically. And then here comes Britain into New Netherlands, which is now New York. Right? So James, the Duke of York, right, is called New York because it was given. It was this land was like, dude, yeah. After the Anglo-Dutch War, right, the Dutch were more concerned about the African posts, about these factories in Africa, than this little outpost here, just these backwater outposts in North America. So they were like, it was pretty much a bloodless letdown, right? Peter Stuyvesant, I think I'm pronouncing that right or wrong, I don't know. But the governor of New York, who was Dutch, right, the Dutch governor of New York at that time, pretty much just surrendered with no fighting, right, with no resistance. And that land right now belonged to the King of England. So the King of England gave it to his brother James, Duke of York, his younger brother, and it's this territory between the Connecticut and Delaware rivers. So this is present day Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and part of Connecticut. Right, so it must be fucking awesome, right, to be the brother of the king and like, here you go, man, all this fucking land for free, right? Well, not. I mean, you know this, right? I mean, there's obviously Native Americans in there. There's issues with this, right? But in the heads of the king, it's like, oh, here's the map of the world. Yeah, you see this little piece right here? Yeah, you can have that, James. Thank you. Right, you're welcome. Right. So that's what's happening here. And it takes a while, right? So it takes James a couple of years to get like his troops ready to go and really settle there, right? So he's not gonna go by himself and be like, "Oh, this is my house, this is my place," right? He's gonna go there armed, with an army. So in 1664, right? Actually, James never goes there. To tell you the truth, James never goes there. He sends a governor, and he sends 400 troops and a couple of warships that easily conquer, right, New Netherlands, New Amsterdam. So now it's James for sure. It's his, right. He's the Duke of York, so he calls it, instead of New Netherland, right, he calls it New York. There was kind of like a split in New York here. So there was like a Dutch part, like afterwards, after the Dutch relinquished this land, right? There was like no executions of the Dutch, right? They pretty much say English were like, we'll keep the same things, more or less the same, kind of, right? Especially where like laws when it comes like to like women, property, owning property and stuff like that, or like religious toleration. The English were more strict, right, than the Dutch. The Dutch were very, very tolerant, very different. They're all about making money. You didn't have to be Protestant, be a merchant, or be whatever, right? Anybody could just walk in there basically. It was, I mean, there was like slaves in New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, and there were slaves were given like half freedoms, the so-called half freedoms they had in the Netherlands. Anyways, the English turned that around. Right? There was like little things that did change the English. But for the most part, it was more or less the same. So New York now was working down basically societal level, like a Dutch part. It's like basically New York City now, along the Hudson River, and then the English part, which was like Long Island, it goes out through the sea to Montauk Bay. Right? So that area there was like English, right? Protestant, and the other was the mix of religion. So it's pretty kind of not cosmopolitan, but pretty diverse, right? It's this New York colony already since its inception. Um, they have a charter of liberties and privileges. In 1683, the Duke agreed, trying to like make it easier to control this new colony of his. It's a royal colony. Right? It's given by a charter by the king. It's a royal colony. To kind of control this colony more easy, to quell the instability in the colonies. He agrees for this elective assembly. It's this Charter of Liberties and Privileges. 1683. So elections are to be held every 3 years for male property owners and the freemen of New York City. You have the traditional English civil rights, trial by jury, and security of property. And you also have religious toleration, but for Protestants. Very, very, very particular for that. So it kind of reinforces the ideas of liberalism, or these principles of liberalism. Basically, is what this is a charter of liberties and privileges embodies. Right? These principles of liberalism. And you might be asking yourself at this moment, like, what the fuck is liberalism, right? Well, liberalism, right, it places emphasis on the individual, this individual liberty. Right? It holds that all humans are equal, equally entitled at least, to enjoy the freedom and fulfillment, um, to fulfill their own lives as they see fit. Um, this means like to seek fulfillment in their work, in their labor, right, and their families, and their religious affiliations in church. It's like about the individual. It's not the king no more. The king is not gonna dictate the way you live. It's the individual. And this is liberalism. It's liberal. You're free. Right? Individual liberty. These are the principles of liberty, of liberalism. So the charter, right, it would guarantee all free men the right to vote and to be taxed, right, only by the representatives. Right, power by jury, due process, freedom of conscience for Christians, and certain property rights for women. Nonetheless, it sounds pretty awesome, but it was I guess a lot of these provisions were rejected that way. But it was a showcase. It illustrates, right, this move away from the yoke of the king, right, into these enlightenment ideas of liberal politics. I mean, so the king refused this. Nonetheless, it still shows this. The king refused this on two counts. Let's kind of go specific here, right? Okay. The king refused to approve the Charter of Liberties and Privileges on two grounds. First of all, it would give New York a whole lot more rights than any other colony, and he seemed like that's going to create tensions and instability, right, for him as a king to control the rest of the other colonies. The second point here, that why he refused this charter, is that this will give New York, right, not only more power among the colonies, but even undermine Parliament, right, and the king himself. Because now the only persons, right, one of the provisions was here is that the only ones to be taxed, right, New Yorkers, the only ones allowed to be to tax New Yorkers is their elected representatives, and that's not Parliament. Parliament is in London. It's not over here in New York, right? So that was right. So these are kind of like forebodying, foreshadowing, right? The same tensions that are brewed in the 1750s and 1760s that is the American Revolution. So that's New York, New Amsterdam, New York, New Netherlands, New York. All right, now let's move on to another middle colony, and this is Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania was a proprietor colony. Right? So you have royal colonies and proprietor colonies. Royal colonies are chartered by the king. Basically, everything's kind of given by the king. But the king kind of has control, direct control over that, right? It gives you the charter, gives you the right to like kind of settle there, but everything under there has to go through the king, right? And then proprietor is like one person, right? The charter, think about like it's a group of people, right? Investors, right? It's a charter, like the Royal African Company is a charter for an investment group, basically, to go and challenge Dutch supremacy of the slave trade. This right here is the same thing, right? The royal charters is kind of like for a company, and proprietors is one person, right? One family. Say. In this case, it's going to be the Penn family, or William Penn. And William Penn was a Quaker. What's cool about Pennsylvania is that it really shows the potential of this new British colonies of how they push or offer to English migrants both religious toleration and economic opportunity. This is what's terribly lacking in England at this moment. In England, like was it like what? I think 1/3 or almost to one half didn't own property at all. We're all property-less wage earners. So England was a lot of poverty, right? So there's a lot of the reasons why most migrate into the British colonies during this century here that we're talking about. About 80% of migrants were indentured servants. They're not free when they got here, right? They were under contract for a couple of years to pay off their passage over here. So why would so many people do that, right? Give up their freedom for 5-7 years in order just to pay for the passage over here? Okay, you can say the head right system. So after they're done with some colonies did give you generous head right system. So once you're done with your indentured servitude contract, they give you a couple of acres. So you got land now, and that's it, right? That's the key word, land, right? LANW, land, right? There's no land in England. It's a tiny little island, and that's why we went to invade Ireland. This pretty much the same time period. That's what we're talking about now. Land, right? There's no land in Ireland, in Europe, in England, because the land, right? You have to go to the cities, right? And now jobs pay so many wage laborers that your wages, yeah, you can choose whatever job you want, but the wages aren't good. So poverty is endemic in London. Right? It's intense. It's a lot everywhere. So people would rather choose, you know what, fuck it. I can't pay to go to America, but at least there's land there. If I make it to these 5-7 years of basically slavery, this is indentured servitude. 80% of all these European migrants or British migrants were indentured servants. Right. So let's get that right. I think we have like a really good, I think a really flawed, mythologized notion of the pilgrims that came here and like all people that came here to establish British North America that were like seeking freedom. They were seeking freedom, the way the means, right, to that end, the freedom, was via indentured servitude for most. Of course, then you had the elite people that had just a lot of fucking money already and just ended up, you know, banking or making even more money because there was more land, and so you had those very few people, but most of them were came as indentured servants. And then you could race up up the ladder, right? More in a sense, right? Because still, there's going to be a time where land becomes not available here, especially as we come into encroach into native land. As soon as we get closer and closer to the Appalachian Mountains, and then now. All right, so Pennsylvania, right? William Penn. All right, so William Penn is a Quaker. Right? He's a son of one of King Charles II's leading supporters. So King Charles II borrowed all this money, basically, from William Penn's father. And in order to pay off all that money that King Charles II had accrued from the Penn patriarch, most easiest way to pay your debts as a king was to give this land faraway places you had no clue about, right? And the map, you own them, right? But in the ground, that was a whole different freaking scenario. Particularly because there was a lot of people living there before, right? Or at this time, they were decimated by disease. There were people there already, right? So one of the ways to pay off his debts to Penn family, King Charles II gives a whole vast tract of land to Penn. Father dies. That charter is picked up, right, by William, the son. And as a Quaker, right, William Penn is eager to move out of England, right? Religious persecution. Say that word. It's a religious persecution. In 1661, as a matter of fact, right, he was jailed 4 times in England in the 1660s, along with one of the first times, along with 4,000 other Quakers. So there was a lot of massive persecution, I guess, against Quakers in England. So Penn receives his charter in 1681, and he raises money. He by selling a lot of land from this charter to a couple of wealthy merchant Quakers. And these Quakers, right, who he sold the land for, gave him government concessions or government positions. So that's the way he was able to raise money to come to England, to come to North America to settle Pennsylvania. The capital, he named it Philadelphia, which means Greek. In Greek, it means the city of brotherly love. It was about to be, he had a whole plan, right? He's a Quaker, right? It's all about pacifism. The Quakers don't believe in war. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why he was jailed in England is because he didn't pay his taxes. Not because he was evading taxes, because he didn't believe in war. And he didn't believe it was right for him, on principles, to pay taxes that was paying the war. Right? So, kind of like the civil disobedience with Henry David Thoreau later on, 400 years later, right? He doesn't pay his taxes, right? Because it's a protest against the war, right? So they're pacifists. Big thing for Quakers. Another big thing for Quakers is that everybody has an inner light. Everybody's equally able to be saved by God. Not like Protestantism or the Puritans up in New England. Only certain motherfuckers, right, are able to be saved, right? Only elected by God. Right? And how do you know who are selected by God in Puritanism? They're fucking rich, right? Obviously, God elected them because everything's going well for them, right? If you're poor, it's because God and fucking like you. Basically, that's kind of the Puritan logic in a nutshell, right? Very crude way, but that's what's going on here. Quakers are like, nah, everybody's able to be saved. Blacks, Indians, whatever. Everybody has that inner light. And then they're all about, pacifists, right? So they don't have guns, right? They're against guns. How do they deal with the Indians? They pay the Indians, right? They're one of these big things like harmonious, or you have to have harmonious relationships with Indians. One of the like William Penn's like big, I guess, like caveats he has for these merchant elites that come and settle Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, William Penn would even pay twice or three times, right? The same land, the same plot of land, because sometimes an Indian would be like, "Well, that's mine," or a Native American would be like, "Well, that's my plot of land," and then William Penn will be, "Oh, here you go, boom, I'll pay for you." And some other guy would be like, "Dude, this guy just swindled you. It's not his land, it's my land," right? And he will pay it again. Okay, well, here you go. So William do everything to avoid right tensions, right, violence with Indians because he was a Quaker. Right? So Philadelphia, right, the city of brotherly love, right, that's trying to embody this here, right, just Quaker principles here. So he wanted harmonious relationships with local Indians, right, and it boomed. Pennsylvania's early history was characterized by rapid growth and prosperity, more or less an egalitarian, more or less form. Um, However, because it was so successful, it failed. Basically, what happened here. Pennsylvania, this progress, right, undermined essentially this cohesiveness, this harmonious principles that William Penn founded Pennsylvania to begin with. Uh, what happened here is that a lot of people came into Pennsylvania, right, and you started encroaching on land, on Indian land, on Native American land. Um, there was a growing racial, I mean, yeah, I guess racial, but more class hierarchy. Right? So because of this progress, also highlighted or accentuated class differences as well. And then in 1700, the Pennsylvania Assembly passed laws that recognized slavery. Although it was not unanimously, there was some resistance to it. But you can tell here now that this morality that William Penn set out was completely undermined by economic um, incentives, basically, by profits. So even though Quakers were against slavery, slavery was recognized in 1700. By 1700, right? It's already kind of early, right? 1781 was when he got his charter. 1782 was when he created Philadelphia, right? So what is it, 18 years? So all his plans were this harmonious, right, brotherly love, right? Philadelphia. It's gone out the window because now we're accepting slavery as the basis of economic profitability. So that's Pennsylvania, with the founding of Pennsylvania, right? And then it gets its own history, right? So now let's talk about another middle colony, as we call them, and this is the Carolinas, South, particularly South Carolina. Here we're going to talk about. So South Carolina is a proprietary colony. One of the main proprietors, a guy named Anthony Ashley Cooper. He was the Earl who would become the Earl of Shaftesbury. He was part of the Lord of Trades. So the Lord of Trades were like this big assembly, this big body, government body in Parliament that would was kind of like a committee in Parliament that would take care of foreign trade in the colonies. It's kind of like a committee on foreign trade. The Lords of Trade. And these motherfuckers would have investments, right? There were politicians that would control foreign policies, basically foreign economic policies, and they were in it, right? A lot of these council members on the Lord of Trades were big-time investors, right? Charter holders of the Royal Africa Company, the Virginia Company, right? Or these land speculators in Virginia. Uh, um, um, and this guy, Ashley Cooper, right, with the same thing, right? This guy went into the West Indies and into Carolinas. Um, Anyways, Anthony Ashley Cooper was one of the proprietors of the South Carolina colony. And with his secretary, at this, if you're into philosophy, you're kind of cool. But his secretary, right? So he hired this guy, another John Locke. So John Locke was Anthony Ashley Cooper's secretary. So both of these guys kind of worked on this thing called fundamental constitution for this new colony of South Carolina. So the fundamental constitutions. And they try to set up this like complex hierarchy. Pretty much they try to recreate feudalism as you know it in medieval times. Right? So you have like it's broken up. The land is broken up in manors. You have a lord, and you have like serfs, and you have it's just feudal. They try to do that. You have the nobles on top, right, and then hereditary serfs at the bottom. And then it also recognized slavery off the back. Right? Because this guy was involved, right, in the slave trade, Anthony Ashley Cooper. And I mean, I never went to it again, just like the Charter of Liberties and Privileges, but it highlights this kind of like a prototype of what would become really the Constitution of the U.S. Specifically, John Locke's ideas, right, of property, right, of the protection of property as the basis of our government. Anyways, all right. So the interesting about the Carolinas, right, besides this Anthony Cooper guy, right, Anthony Ashley Cooper, is that the Carolinas was supposed to be like this offshoot, the colony of a colony. Right? So the Carolinas was basically settled by the sons of rich plantation owners in the West Indies, in the Caribbean island of Barbados. So Barbados was Britain's jewel of the West Indies. Sugar plantations there. We're banking, right? We're making mad money. And so you had some very, very extremely rich plantation British owners there. And there was no land left in Barbados. Right? It's a tiny little island. So they were like, well, let's go to the mainland, right? North America, and to recreate this stuff, these plantations there. So that's how it happened, right? So there's Barbados, so-called Barbados connection. Barbados. Barbados connection. So this Caribbean island, Barbados, was settled in 1627, and it became one of the world's major producers of sugar. So sugar, to give you a quick little background, right? It goes back to like in the Crusades when we first found out about sugar. Holy shit, it's just fucking good. I'm drinking some chai here with, I guess some sugar. All right, and honey. That's when the Crusades were like, that stuff is good. So let's try to find a route over there, right? Find sugar. And we were able to recreate that first in the Azores and then Madeira. Portuguese did this, and then they brought it over to the West Indies, right here in the Western Hemisphere. And Right, the French had their own sugar plantations, right, in Saint Domingue, in the West Indies, in the Caribbean Islands, and the British had Barbados. And Barbados became a major source of the world's sugar. Mad fucking money. By then, by 1627, Barbados already had an African majority population, mostly slaves, working these plantations, the sugar plantations. Became Britain's first slave society, Barbados. By the end of the 7th century, so 1690s, Barbados was the most productive of all the Britain's colonies. Its per person income, right, per capita income, was much higher than in England. It was not equally shared, right, as wealth. Person, right? You had the rich plantation owners and a whole fucking bunch of slaves. And the British magnified this difference between the slave owners and the slaves by codifying slavery, by making slavery law, basically. So the Barbadians, right, these British plantation owners in Barbados, were the first to portray Africans as beasts. And the racism of the Caribbean planters was intense, absolutely fucking intense. Slave codes were the harshest here in Barbados, and anywhere in the Atlantic world, right? Harsher than the Spanish, right? When you think about the Black Legend, right? Harsher than the French, right? Barbados was just brutal, fucking slave labor. Male slaves who were convicted of a crime could be burned at the stake, beheaded, starved, or castrated. So when Caribbean slavery, right, when these people from Barbados, right, gave this shit to their sons, right, all this shit here, all this fucking baggage, right, all this mentality, all this racism was brought over as well into the Carolinas. So when Caribbean slavery was imported into the Carolina, all these attitudes came with it as well. The Carolinas, right, had the harshest slave codes in North America. But even though, so whereas these laws separated, right, black and white between Europeans, right, British and slaves, had really harsh punishments. In between Europeans, white Europeans, right, the laws were kind of like lax, were made more lax. So restrictions against Irish Catholics, for example, and Jews, for example, were lifted after Barbados became a slave society. So this is what's going on. For white Europeans, you're getting more freedom, whether you're Jewish or Irish. But for African slaves, you're getting fucked. Your freedom is getting taken away. Made law. This is what's going on here, right? And these attitudes, right, this framework, right, this slave societal framework was transported, right, was transplanted to Carolina, South Carolina. All right. So African slaves were imported to Carolina from the outset, from the very beginning. That was, it wasn't like a gradual thing. It was like from the very beginning, we're going to be a slave society. Right? Where the difference between a society with slaves, the slave society here, is that a slave society, everything, right, pretty much, right, is dependent on slave labor. Right? Your economy, everything is on slavery, an institution of slavery. Everything revolves around that. Society with slaves is just that. Society that has other things going on for this economy, right? Independent farmers, right? Artisans, whatever, shipbuilding, blah, 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 whatever. And then it has, right, slaves, right? Helping with the shipbuilding, helping with the artisan making, helping with the farming. But it's not the central thing that makes the society thrive. Right? Slave society is that. Right? So it's a slave society. It's not a society with slaves. So there's a distinction here going on here. Some historians actually argue that a distinction is kind of erroneous. That actually, like, especially when you break it down between New England, right, and then like the southern colonies. Right? So there's like a big, I guess, like a mainstream kind of like narrative that the northern colonies were never like slave societies. They were society with slaves, but not slave societies. As the southern colonies that were dependent on cash crops were, right, in these plantations. Some historians kind of argue against it. Like, no, they were all slave societies because we really don't count on the North Indian slavery. So once we count Indian slavery in the North, it's very clear that slavery is very central to that society as well. So there's that debate going on there. It's fascinating stuff there. Anyways, let's go back to Carolina and the Barbados connection, right? Barbados, right, is a beautiful fucking place, right? If you go vacation there. Once the COVID-19 dies down, that'd be a great place to go, right? Barbados. But mind, right, where you're going, that was slaves were being executed and castrated and whatnot, right? By 1720, okay, so Africans were imported into Carolina from the outset. But in 1690, they weren't able to recreate sugar as their main crop. They found out that rice grows really well in the Carolinas kind of land in their soil. So this crop, rice, increased the demand for slave labor. And rice became the region's major source of income. And Africans became much more valuable because of that too. By 1720, Africans composed more than 70% of Carolina's population. So Carolina really resembled the Caribbean islands, right? More than any other colony in the mainland. Then I guess I'll wait till we get talking about slavery itself, because there was different kind of like slave systems between the colonies. But let me just talk about the colonies now, and then we'll talk about slavery between the colonies. Okay. All right, so that's all I want to talk about Carolina. Okay? So now, where are we at here? Barbados. This. Pennsylvania. It's about. Slavery. That's kind of like the origins of slavery. So let's talk about let's talk about slavery then. Let's do that. All right, so slavery. It's been around basically forever, right? Pyramids. Who built the pyramids in Giza, right? Slaves. Who built the aquifers in the Roman times, right? The not aquifers, or what is it? The aqueducts. Aquifers. Fuck, aquifers are natural. The aqueducts to transport water from faraway places into Rome. Roman, all roads lead to Rome, right? All this stuff, right, was built by slaves. So slavery is nothing new. It's been around. And like I said in the beginning, Africans themselves were very much involved in the African slave trade. There were wars going on in between Central African kingdoms, right? The Dahomey, the Congo, Benin, the Ashanti. These very powerful African kingdoms, and they were at war with each other. And when they would lose, one side would lose, the other side were captured by warriors and their families, and they would become slaves, right, war captives. And these were then sent out, marched out to the coast, the western coast of Africa, and it's sold to Europeans, right? Portuguese first, and then the rest, right? Came the Dutch, British, right? Just talking about that. And so, right, Africa. I mean, slavery was not new, right? What we're talking about here, right? Keep that in mind. As a matter of fact, think about the word itself, slavery. Right? The etymology of the word slavery, it comes from the word Slav, right, which European, which is over there for the Caucasus regions, or right, like Russia. Russia, right? So there's a white slavery, uh, uh, trade of white slavery that was going on over there in the Caucasus regions, and we're bringing them down to like, what would be Constantinople, or these Middle Eastern, or Indian, empires, right? So Slav, right, it comes from like this word from Slavic, from the Slavic people, slavery. So slavery is nothing new, right? And also, what I have to keep in mind here too is that this idea of racism, as we know it now, it's not really solidified as it was. But it took a while, like I just showed you in the Barbados, right? It took. It wasn't like one from one day to the next where they just like, we're gonna create. How can I say? Slaves are inferior. It took laws to get there. A whole set of laws to get there, right? But once we got there, right, it was solidified, right? So race was not really well defined. Let's put it that way. That's the best way to put it here. Racism was not well defined. What was well defined though by let's say what I'm talking about here is the 16th century, right, and going into the 17th century. By the 18th century, no, racism was everywhere, really well established. But before that, we didn't have racism, right, as we know it today, right. This was more in the 18th century when it became really structural, created basically, and reinforced, reified. Race, what was really a thing back then, prior to the 18th century and late 17th century, was the notion between barbarism and civilization. So this is why Irish people, when the British invaded Ireland, right, they were cast as barbaric. So when the British came to North America, when they first encountered the Indians, they were also called barbaric. So it wasn't really like, these people are more tan, right? Tawny, right? They have the Indian color, per se. And Irish people are the same color as most British people. White. And so it was the color, right? This racism was not really based on color. It was based upon civilized, right? Notions of civilization and notions of barbarian. And this is what the Romans had, right? This was what racism, though, does begin, right? Like I said, the late 17th century and the early 18th century. So 1690s, I'm talking about 1790s and 1800s, just really becomes, 1690s and 1700s really becomes 1750s. It really becomes law. And I'll go over a couple of laws right now, especially in Virginia. You'll see this in Virginia, that transition from a society with slaves to a slave society really well. So we have this civilization versus barbarism, Christianity versus heathenism. It wasn't really based on a color, right, or on a race per se, right? This scientific, right, or the pseudo-scientific idea of racism, was not really well defined at this moment. Right? But Africans were though seen as so alien, right, so different, right, non-Christian, so heathen, right, and their way of civilization was not civilized in the eyes of the Europeans, that was easy to them to be categorized as inferior, nonetheless. Right? So I'm not trying to minimize here, right, or justify anything here. I mean, it's just like the terms were not there, right? Race and racism, those terms were not there yet. The actions themselves, though, were, right? We were already well established that Africans were lesser than us, right? They were enslavable, right? That's the word I'm trying to find here, right? These people were enslavable. Just like a really poor Englishman, right, was enslavable, so was Africans. But then a change where in the late 17th century, basically 1750s. By then, for sure, right, you could not enslave a white person. That was only based on color now. So there's a transition here I'm trying to highlight here, right, of how we got into this racist paradigm we're still dealing with today. All right. All right. So we're another difference between slavery, or a good distinction that makes, I guess, slavery here in North America different from everywhere else, I guess, is that here was a permanent thing. Like I said, in New Netherlands, you could buy your freedom, right? Or you were given half freedom. Right? In Latin America, for example, there was a lot of slavery, sure. Perhaps even more slaves were taken to Brazil than anywhere else in the New World. But there was a couple of things going on. Slaves who were able to buy their freedom eventually, if they were able to, I guess, sell their labor to people. That would happen back then. That was the thing. So you're a slave owner. You would rent out your slave to another person. Right? So somebody needs a slave for a weekend, rent them out. Right? I mean, it's kind of like catering, right? We fucking get catering. Anybody worked at a restaurant, right? Be a servant. It's just fucking the same thing as being a slave. Anyways, right? So in Latin America, that was the thing, right? Or manumissions, right? When, like, for example, a lot of like rich, wealthy plantation owners in Brazil and in Latin America, when like their daughter would get like the quinceañera, or one of their sons was being married, right? To show off, right, how chingones they were. It will be like, oh, a part of like, or as part of our gift here, we're gonna manumate, we're gonna we're gonna liberate one of our slaves. It's a symbol of our whatever the fuck they want to symbolize, right? So that was a thing there. That was a tradition back then, right? The manumission of slaves for occasions. That was not a thing here at all. North America. Why? Because you needed your slaves for labor. Right? There was such a quench for labor. That's why indentured servitude was a thing, right? Because we needed labor. Right? So you didn't want to liberate your slaves at all. No, you work them to death. Right? You want to work them and make your investment return, give you some returns. So that's one of the main things, right? So it's plantation. It was based on this plantation system, right? On intense agricultural labor. And you have this plantation, right? Think about the plantation, right? A slave owner, one person, and a whole gang of slaves, right? So slave revolts are a thing that slave owners have to watch out for. So that's why discipline and slave codes were so harsh on this plantation because you don't want your slaves to rise up and kill you, basically. So that's why this police system was rigidly set up to police slaves. Right? So when you think about police, right, the origins of police is to police slaves, African black bodies. Let's get that straight too. Right now, we're at it. Along with this, right, this need of this plantation system, right, of slavery in this British North American coastline, Atlantic coastline, is the creation, right, of a sharp boundary between slavery and freedom. The labor on this plantation was much more demanding than slavery, say, in the mine or something, or as a servant in the household in New England. Right? But as opposed to slavery, say, in the old world, slavery over here in the new world, right, eventually become equated with race and color. Okay? And this is a concept that drew from this permanent, right, distinction between white and black, phenotypes, people. So think about this, right? So Africa, so slavery in Africa, right? So African slaves, right, in Africa existed a long time. But over there, right, it was easy to blend in if you were free, where you escaped your master. We here in the Americas, you have a whole bunch of white people, you have a whole bunch of Native American people, and then you have slaves. As the slaves, you stand out, right? That sucks. Right? So that was a marker, right? It was a marker that made it easier to control, right? Because that plantation system needed that structure of control, of policing people. All right. So I talked about slavery in the West Indies already, sugar, Portuguese stuff. Let's talk about slavery in the law. Right. The codification of slavery in legal statutes. So again, right, like in Spain, slaves in Spain had legal recourse. They had, they could go to trial, stuff, right? Back in early colonial America in Virginia, when the first slaves came here off of a Dutch boat, 1619. Slaves were able to get freedom eventually. There's one guy, Anthony Johnson, that by the 1620s, not only did he get his freedom, he was able to buy slaves for himself and own a plantation. So so back then, there was pathways to freedom for slaves. Early colonial America. By the mid 1700s, by the mid 1600s, I'm saying, sorry, by the mid 1620, no, 17. Let me see. Let me bust out with this first law here. Virginia, 1662, 1660s, 1670s. That was out the window. So prior to 1660, to the mid 17th century, prior to that, laws, especially like in Virginia and Maryland, that was really dependent on slavery, did not refer specifically to slavery. But as tobacco plantations spread, and this demand for labor spread as well, the status of white servants had to be explicitly differentiated from the status of slaves, African slaves. So, let me give you a whole series of laws. Virginia slaves, from 1662 to 1670. So in December 1662, Act 7, right, and I'm just reading it for slave straight from the sources here. Negroes, women, children to serve according to the condition of the mother. But it says, whereas some doubt have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman to be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. And that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. So this is saying that so what's going on here is that the give you here a little bit of context here. What's going on here with this law of 1662 in Virginia slave code? Before this, the tradition, the custom here was that lineage was based upon the man. So if you were an Englishman, right, and you had sex with your slave, woman slave, and you guys had a kid, that kid, because it's on your lineage, he'll be free. He's following the father's inheritance. But this law flips that around, and it says that if English male, right, free male, slave owner, right, basically rapes slave woman he owns, they have a kid, that slave is going to follow the inheritance, the status of the woman, which is slave. So that kid now will become a slave. So now, after this law of 1662, right, slave women became freaking valuable, right? You know, it was a premium on slave women, right? So the most valuable slaves were like strong young men, right, to work their asses to death, and then women basically pump out babies to give you more fucking slaves. I mean, this is fucking, raping them, right? You buy this woman, and with the intention of raping them, so you can get more slaves and for fucking free. I don't know, man. This just this always astounds me, man. This was the intention for this law. But this law now, here what it say? What the fuck does it say here? It's fucking bullshit. Be it therefore enacted and declared by this present and grand assembly. What the fuck is so grand about this shit, right? That all children born in the country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. So if you're a slave owner and you have slave women, right, a couple, one or two or one, and you rape them and you have a child, that child is a slave. You own that slave now. You could do as you want. It's your property. Here's your another slave code. September 1667, Act 3. An act declaring that baptisms of slaves doth not exempt them from bondage. So basically here is saying that back then if you're a slave and you were like, you could go to the court and be like, yo, I'm a Christian. Like, Christians should not be enslaved. It's kind of just not. Even if you're a Christian, you're still a slave because you're African. October 1669. An act about the Castro killing of slaves. Let me just read it. Exactly what it's. Whereas the only law in force for the punishment of refractory servant assisting their master, mistress, or overseer cannot be inflicted upon Negroes, or the obstinacy of many of them by other than violent means suppressed. Be it enacted and declared by this grand assembly, if any slave resists his master or others by his master's order correcting him, and by the extremity of the correction should chance to die, death shall not be considered a felony, but the master or that person appointed by the master to punish him be acquit from molestation, since it cannot be presumed that malice existed, which alone makes murder a felony, or that anything should induce any man to destroy his own estate. So before this act, if you killed your slave, whether by accident because you whipped him too much or whatever, or you straight up just fucking killed them, you were charged with murder, or you could have been charged with murder. You could have. Now, after this act of 1669, an act about the Castro killing of slaves, now you're not charged with felony murder. Because it doesn't make sense. This is what it's saying right here. It doesn't make sense that a person would destroy its own property. So it was never made with malice. And that's what you need. That's the legal requirement for felony murder. Malice intent. And because it doesn't make sense that somebody would destroy their own property, it cannot have malice intent. Thus, if you kill your slave, it's cost free. You can't be charged or molested. And I could go on and on with this shit. But I'll stop there because it really fucking pisses me off. To be honest, it does. So let me chill here for a little moment. And the assembly that these fuckers are talking about is the Virginia House of Burgesses. It's the elected officials of this colony. The elite, right? This is where George Washington comes from. Right? The family comes from. Jefferson. Yeah. Just this is the lineage, right? This is the background that our founding fathers have. So by 1680, long story short, by 1680, even though the black population was still kind of relatively small compared to like Carolina or later on Georgia, Barbados for that, racial differences were codified law. So in British North America, unlike the Spanish Empire, for example, there was no like mulatto or mestizo or metis like in the French, right? Which is black and white. When you're black, you're not free. When you're white, you are. 1680, that's really when it became, boom, structured. And it's been plaguing us ever since. What, 2020? 2021 now? We're still dealing with this shit. All right, let's talk about Bacon's Rebellion. Let me take a little break here. Okay, I'm back. All right, slavery. All right, so Virginia. Let's move to Virginia here now. One of the oldest colonies here. So by the 17th century here, by the final quarter of the final century now, we're talking 1750, 17 on. There's a lot of transformations, a lot of transformations, instability, political and social instabilities. Um, and one of those events that really kind of illustrates this instability, right? It's just this transition, this transformation here is Bacon's Rebellion. Uh, so let's talk about Bacon's Rebellion. So finally, like I don't know if you noticed in the last when we're talking about founding of Virginia, so the land was not nice. It was really harsh, right? And life expectancy high. Um, life expectancy wasn't high. Child mortality was very high as well. It was a very brutal way of life. By 1700s, 1750s, by this time period here, no, not 1700s, by the 1600s, 1650s, going into the 1700s, right? It's turning into that century there. The climate improves, right? Virginia improves, basically overall. One example of this, for example, is like the apples, orchards. So the apple trees that they planted that kind of failed in the first time. Now they're maturing. Now they're giving a lot of apples. So instead of drinking like this swamp water or they were drinking before, right, this poisonous water full of malaria, cholera and stuff. Now they're drinking cider. So now we're healthier in Virginia, basically. And we have more indentured servants coming in. That's always good. However, though, so Virginia seems to be going good. Nonetheless, the best lands are already claimed by the elite families and landscape speculators. The land to the west, so the land to the east, right, land on the coast and stuff, was already occupied, and the land on the west was occupied by Native Americans. So there was like this land crunch happening here in Virginia. Yet you have a bunch of indentured servants coming in, right, to help out with the tobacco plantations. And these guys are not really slaves yet. Right? Indentured servants. So within 5-7 years, they're free. And shit, there's no land. What the fuck do we do? And this kind of brings a lot of instability, right? Just tension over here. Taxes, besides this, a lot of taxes were high on tobacco, which is the main cash crop here in Virginia. Anyways, it was just a lot of tensions were brewing at this moment, right? So we have a bunch of indentured servants filling the ranks of the lower classes, right? And they're becoming restless, right? And then the elites, the way they respond to the brewing tensions is that they increase the length of servitude for the contract of indentured servants. And they stiffen the penalties for running away. So that creates more tension, right? Doesn't cause nothing at all. So here comes in Nathaniel Bacon. And Nathaniel Bacon is not even an indentured servant. Motherfucker's rich as fuck. But he's an elite. But he's not. He's kind of like, oh, he's welcome into. So you have Governor Berkeley here, Virginia, and Governor Berkeley has a clique going on. Like he has like his cronies. The Council of State, basically, that's what it has. It's kind of like an assembly there going on. The Council of State. And so Nathaniel Bacon, he's young, he's well educated, from a wealthy family, a very prominent family, and he really makes a big impression on this clique, on his Council of States. But the way he makes an impression is by always criticizing Governor Berkeley. So there's like a tension between the elites themselves here going on already, between Bacon and then Berkeley, governor. So there's like a political factions going on between the elites. And let's see how do I say it? What's going on is that in 1676 in Virginia, this is what always happened. This was like routine where a Virginian, a British settler, would like injure or damage something about Native Americans. Maybe kill somebody native, or steal something, or damage their crops. Something that was very very common was that they would damage like the corn. The Indians would be damaged, like their own plantations would be damaged by the settlers encroaching on their land, and it was very routine for the Indians to expect like a gift, right? For like reparations basically. And in 1676, this happened. Um, Taking payment from some goods they had delivered to a planter, and the planter didn't deliver the money back. A band of Doeg Indians uh, went to retaliate. So where's our money, basically? And they killed the planter's overseer, and they tried to steal the planter's pigs, their hogs. Um, and like I said, like this was kind of like routine, right? Like if you injure me, nothing beyond that. Right? For years, that was part of the middle ground, so-called middle ground. Where not the Virginians or the Native Americans had full control of the whole land. You kind of like negotiate with these like gift giving or with like retaliatory violence. But this one time here, it instead of being like sporadic violence, it just created like this. It escalated to like this campaign of intense revenge from the Virginians against the Native Americans. So this isolated incident of a militia soon became a militia of about 1,000 men, which was a big ass fucking force back then. To raise 1,000 men versus a band of Indians. How many could they be? 16, 12 maybe at the most. So you have 1,000 men to retaliate against these guys here. Right. So for 6 weeks, this war party, right, these militiamen, laid siege to the reservation of the Shushkahenaks. And this is a tribe that was unwittingly drawn into the war. They had nothing to do with this with the first incident. They were just in there, the wrong place at the wrong time, I guess, right? So this militia were attacking these natives, the Shushkahenaks, who in turn defended themselves, right? So it just kind of like added more, like kind of create like this vicious cycle here of settlers versus Indians, and it's just really nasty here. The middle ground totally broke down and created a warfare here, some Indian wars. So the Virginians asked Governor Berkeley for help. Help us out, defeat these Indians. It's part of your fucking job as a governor of Virginia. But the Governor Berkeley refused to fight the Shushkahenaks. So the frontier planters, right, the ones that were in the front lines, right, were furious about this. It was like, they betrayed us. Right, the governor, our own governor, is betraying us, and is siding with the Indians. And the planters, they use gossip basically, right, that the Governor Berkeley and his own little clique had deals with these Indians for the fur trade, and we're banking, we're banking, and they were indeed making deals with these Indians. And that's one of the reasons why the governor didn't want to fight these guys, because they were trade partners. Right? These frontier farmers, small farmers, right, who wanted the Indians' land, basically wanted the Indians dead. They wanted them away, to open up that land up over in Virginia. I felt betrayed by the governor, and thus here comes Nathaniel Bacon. Right, he says his discontent. He's like, here's my chance to screw over this governor, man, to get in power. So Nathaniel Bacon agreed to lead, his wife's encouragement. So his wife encouraged Nathaniel Bacon to go ahead and lead this band of discontented farmers, basically, to lead a wholesale war on quote unquote all Indians whatsoever. So Nathaniel Bacon massacred some other Indians, Oconochees. They marched to the government capital at Jamestown, 400 armed men. They demanded that all Indians in general be named enemies. Berkeley agreed to this, but then he changed his mind, and then he lost control. Basically, he had to flee across the shore to the eastern shore. Long story short, a royal commission, basically the king, had to send British soldiers, 1,000 men, actually, in January 1677 to put down the rebellion by Bacon. Bacon by this time had already died, and Berkeley had regained control by this time. 23 rebel leaders were executed. However, the king removed Berkeley from office as governor. And after Bacon's death, the rebellion kind of just dissipated. What's interesting about this rebellion is that it wasn't just like these white farmers, but Bacon was also able to recruit slaves. And it was like this cross coalition between poor white farmers, slaves, for the purposes of Indian land. So poor white farmers got together with slaves, and under the leadership of Nathaniel Bacon, to kill Indians to open up land for them. This is Bacon's rebellion. Right, beautiful. anyways, it scared the freaking government, right? It scared the king. It scared the British, authorities, right? To see this coalition of white and black, or basically, right, indentured servants and slaves together, rising up to topple down the governor, right? Governor Berkeley. Fuck no, we can't have that. So what Bacon Rebellion really, what the consequences of Bacon Rebellions is that the division, right, between white and black had to be more staunch, right? You cannot have white poor people get together with black poor people on top of the government. You got to break that apart. So let's give more freedom to the white indentured servants, the white part farmers, and let's make slavery more stringent. And let's codify slavery. And another obvious consequence of Bacon's rebellion is the policy of Indian removal, basically. So it begins here. It's like, you know what? Instead of like trying to trade with the Indians, it's clear we gotta get rid of them for different purposes, right? Not just to get to open up the land, but also to avoid these uprisings. It's like a pressure valve here, right? All right. Okay, so authorities reduced taxes, adopted a more aggressive Indian policy, opened up western areas to small farmers. And then they accelerated the shift to slaves on these tobacco plantations. So one of the policies here, right, to avoid this was to reduce the amount of indentured servants, but increase the amount of slaves. We don't have this cross-racial coalition against the governor, against the government. So here we see Virginia transforming itself, becoming a slave society, right? More or less because, right, of these tensions of these, right, such as Bacon rebellions show. And that was not the only one. There was other, like, uprisings and stuff like that. I mean, that kind of made the government realize, like, oh, we should do something about this, right? We should avoid this at all costs. So, in 1705, Virginia had a very thorough slave code in place. Let's use slaves and not depend so much on the nature servants. Let's use slaves, and let's make that distinction between white freedom and black slavery crystal clear. Make it law, basically. So in 1680, I'll give you some statistics here. In 1680, only 7% of Virginia's population was African. But by 1700, the proportion had increased to 28%. Half the labor force of Virginia in 1700 was enslaved. So yeah. That's slavery. I mean, all slavery has everything, I mean, some things in common. So let's make that clear now before I end this. Slavery has some things in common, right? Violence, one of the main things slavery is known for. It's perpetual, right? And slaves usually don't have like kins, right? It's kinlessness, right? You don't have like brothers and family, right? Your property. Right? So it's a lifelong condition. You have no legal way to be recognized as a family, right? Family relationships, and it rests on violence, on the threat of violence to operate. However, American slavery added some elements to this as well. First of all, slavery in the Americas was hereditary, passed on from the mother to the child. Second, compared to other slave systems, manumissions in the American, what would become the American South, was extremely rare. And then finally, right, this is what we got here to this transition here. Slavery was racial here in the Americas, in the American South. Slavery was reserved only for Africans and Indians. They were the ones that became enslavable now. So by the mid 17th century, late 17th century, right, transition here, slavery now is based on color. So this is basically the transition I'm trying to get at in the lecture. How slavery became, right, the main central, I guess, source of economic prosperity for the American colonies. So how we went from a society with slaves to a slave society. And how this was racialized. It was before barbarity and civilization, Christians and heathens, and now it's between white and black. So this is the end of part one. I'll finish up part two, which is basically diversity of colonial society in these North American British colonies during the 17th century, going into the early 18th century. Okay, so we'll see you for part 2.